200 years ago, Springfield does not exist. It's here at this star. And the biology, as I mentioned, is very different. Schoolcraft talks about the prairie starting in downtown Springfield, patches of prairie. He describes the grass being taller than a man on horseback. We tend to forget that. That's why there's some very fertile ground in downtown Springfield and where the mall is located, that Kickapoo Prairie. So extensive grasslands. The large trees mainly followed the creek basins and river basins. So this area that we're standing now, Jordan Creek, would have been a classic Ozark stream. Spring-fed, year-round flow, and alongside it, the oak hickory trees, this forested area. This, you see that there are no settlements, no cabins in this area. This was the Osage Indian hunting ground. And Schoolcraft describes some of those camps, so it wouldn't surprise us somewhere along Jordan Creek to come across one of those Native American hunting camps, the Osage Indians. Schoolcraft describes their living quarters. He talks about them being dome-shaped, almost like an upside-down bird's nest, with a hole in the top and then a hole in the side to move in and out of. So they would make them using long, sharp sticks, wedging both end in the ground and arching those over, and then weaving other material in to make them watertight. And he would describe that campground as a central location. There was a fire where they would cook meat and everybody would eat off from that in the morning. And then there were rings of these tent-like structures around. We looked at the animal life that you would find. Schoolcraft talks about the bison that were in this area, and the elk, and the wolves, and many other things that no longer exist here. So it looks very different. The plants would be different too. Along this creek right now, unfortunately, we have some invasive species. There's bush honeysuckle and some other invasive species here. That's changed too. A gentleman named John Pope Campbell and his brother were exploring this. There are different stories within the family about how John Pope Campbell found this area. But they certainly traveled up the White River and then up the James River and then came across what we refer to as Jordan Creek, this spring-fed, crystal clear water. And looking at the vegetation that was here, he knew that this would make good cropland for his family and a place to settle. Now, some of the stories talk about how he found this next thing. Some say it was with the help of some of the Indians in the area because he saved one of the youth from a fever. Who knows? But we do know that as John Pope Campbell was exploring this area, he came across something even better than this spring-fed stream. He found a natural well. It was an opening in the earth that kind of gave a window into the underground passageway system that kind of runs through Springfield because of our harsh topography. But all he had to do was lower a bucket into that opening, and it was an unending supply of fresh spring water. So if you're looking for a place to settle, probably better than coming across gold, because he could build his cabin right next to that, would not have to go down to the creek, would not have to chop ice, just lower a bucket and an unending supply of clean fresh water. So he goes back to Tennessee. He and his brother go back to Tennessee. They talk about what they found, and then more than a few people in 1830 moved out to this area and settled what would become Springfield. So where the square is located, that's John Pope Campbell's cornfield, or was part of his cornfield. And he was one of those early founders. Now, John Pope Campbell traveled this way with his wife and kids, and also at least 6 slaves, depending upon what the records show. So early Springfield owes its existence to a lot of people working together. This is 1863. It's a portion of a really cool map of war, and it's showing the advancement of a rebel battery as they are attacking Springfield. And Springfield had many forts scattered throughout it. The Union troops had built many forts to protect Springfield. But I like this map for lots of different reasons, because it gives us some insight about Jordan Creek and how it affected the growth of Springfield. So Jordan Creek is flowing through here, and you see it almost cuts the town in half. There are only a few roads crossing the creek. So this is Boonville that's coming across right here, and others stop short. And part of that is this extensive limestone bluff that existed on the south side of the creek. So remember, things don't look like this now. Even if we get rid of the buildings, there would have been this limestone bluff along this southern edge. And it looked, again, very different. Now, Springfield is appropriately named. There are many springs throughout Springfield, and this map shows a couple of them that were important to the forts. Fort number 2 was built here on this high rise, which would allow it to see a long distance, but also close to Fulbright Spring. And they built a rifle pit to access that spring. Now, just a few years ago, we uncovered Fulbright Spring, and it's just a short distance that direction. And then over here is something referred to as Berry Spring, or also Jones Spring. Its name changed over time, and if you were to look closely, this says Convalescent Hospital. But Berry was a Southern sympathizer, and when he left and went south, they took over his house and used this as a hospital and used the cool water from the spring to help the troops dealing with fever to cool them down. And that spring disappeared in a hole in the ground, and then this is one of the branches of Jordan Creek here. The other thing, just as a footnote, that's kind of cool to me, this street says to Jefferson City, Jefferson Street, right? This down here to Mount Vernon Street. This fort here, the street that continues, that's Fort Street. So the names go back to founding fathers, or just how you got from A to B back in the old days. This is 1908. And I know it's difficult to see, but you get an idea of how much more developed it is in just 25 years. In 25 years, you have all of this located right across from us, right across Jordan Creek. So if you look here, that's the old Frisco Railroad Depot. So this is the happening place. This is where people are traveling in and out of Springfield. There are hotels around here and bars or saloons, and the happening place. Marissa, they referred to this creek.
Oh, so the city engineer that had become so like putrid and nasty actually refers to the Jordan Creek as a death-breeding cesspool.
Yeah, not quite how you want to describe the waterway going through the middle of your town at this point. So they channelize it. So they take out the meanders, they line it with stones. They want to get the water out of town as fast as they can. This death-breeding cesspool that is polluted and there's no life found in it. They talk about the death knell of Jordan Creek. So this is 1908. Flooding continues to become a problem and gets even worse. More development, more impervious areas, so where rain doesn't wash off, causes more flash flooding. It runs drier in the summertime, and it's a stinky mess. No sewer system. I think sewer systems were started in the late 1800s, but they didn't treat the sewer. They just collected it, ran it down, and then they dumped it back into Jordan Creek a little bit to the south, much to the dismay of the people living along the creek at that time. Things got a little bit better in it got a little bit worse in 1908, again with all the runoff. And then in 1909, Springfield experienced what they referred to as the Great Flood. And I know it may be a little difficult to look at later. This is Boonville Street. This is the water here, and these are horses. So the water is up past the belly of the horses on Boonville Street. This is an area between the square and Chestnut Expressway. There's actually a railroad running through here, but all this debris has been washed up. There are people standing in the water this deep here. Tremendously damaging event. No people were lost in this, but a large number of livestock. They talk about 100 horses drowning. We need to do something about this. We need to continue the straightening, the channelizing, line the banks with rock. This certainly does not look like a natural creek. It's starting to look more like a ditch. So the idea is to turn Jordan Creek into a ditch and get this polluted water out of here as fast as possible. And their solution to that pollution and the polluted water was to completely enclose Jordan Creek, and that's the part that we're going to explore. So in 1928, 1929, they turned Jordan Creek into a box culvert. They built sides on it, put a lid on it, wanted to get that stinky mess out of sight, out of mind, and that's this red streak that you see that goes through the middle of town. So a lot of people aren't aware that there's a creek, an underground creek, flowing through the middle of Springfield. That is Jordan Creek, and that's what we're going to drop in and explore.
That's a pretty good one. I can smell it.
Walk down into the creek, there's a couple of things. First, some safety issues. Can't emphasize enough, watch your step through here. Boonville Street, they did this first section. And why they did it this way, that's kind of lost over time, but there's a center wall dividing it, and each section's about 12 foot wide and 12 foot tall, and the floor is sloped. And that sloped floor keeps water in the main channel and limits erosion at the sides where And then where these columns are located, why they use columns here instead of continuing the wall, it looks like they planned on doing that with this reinforcement bar that you see here to tie in the concrete wall. Above this, in the early 1900s, was the old Oasis Saloon. So this was the happening place. The saloon was here, and it existed for a while. There are people alive today that swear up and down they remember going to the bathroom in the Oasis Saloon, and whatever they were doing would drop straight down into the creek below, which helps explain the cesspool. Right. Obviously, not happening now. Wastewater is going separate directions.
That is kind of cute, isn't it?
I've seen the original plans, and it does have a slope pool, so I don't know about that. But certainly keeping it in the center channel causes the erosion to happen here and reduces the erosion at the sidewalls, which put the tunnel in danger of collapsing. So the other thing you'll notice, there are different openings into the tunnel, like this square opening here. The openings down low seem to be designed to allow spring water or groundwater to find its way back to Jordan Creek. And that makes sense. If they built this concrete wall and you had a lot of water pressure on the back, that water's going to be trying to find a way to get through. And we know from some of the documentation throughout Springfield, there were a number of small springs. Now those disappeared over time with construction, and when you stop letting the water, the groundwater recharge, when you force it to rush off to the creek, you alter that spring flow. But some of these still have water flowing from them. So openings down low, probably for spring water. And then you'll find openings up high. Like we just passed one down there on the left. Maybe shine a light and find there's an opening there at the top. The openings at the top are where stormwater was allowed to return to Jordan Creek. This is an important part of the city's infrastructure during the stormwater runoff. And so those storm drains that we see alongside parking lots and streets, they connect to pipes or culverts that empty that stormwater here. And one of the things that we want the public to know, and one of the best things you can do to help protect water quality, is to make sure we're limiting any kind of pollution that's going out onto the streets and into the parking lots, that vehicles are properly maintained and not leaking antifreeze and other fluids that will flush and come back into the creek, that people aren't just tossing cigarette butts out the window, those get washed back into the creek. It's easier to keep the pollution out of it than try to clean up the pollution after the fact. As you come by here, if you cast your lights and look up these side tunnels, these are storm drains bringing storm water back to Jordan Creek. And Clarissa, do you want to tell them a little bit about this one on the left, especially what it's made of?
Sure. And so a lot of times when like the news or the cities or other places are talking about infrastructure, they're not always just talking about roads and bridges, sidewalks. There's a lot of stuff under the ground that you may not be able to see. And stormwater pipes and sanitary sewer lines are part of those. So if you look, and there are many, many inlets and storm drains that connect right to the surface as we go throughout Jordan Creek, but they aren't just unique to Jordan Creek. They're all over every city in the world. Just install it on quite a bit, so that quickly it does get under.
As a frame of reference, right now we're underneath Campbell Street. And this archway was made from limestone from the quarries located near here, and was, according to the records we could find, this was constructed in 1880. So think about how long this has been here, still supporting Campbell Street traffic today, and lasting much longer than some of the other infrastructure like this that was more recent. But this archway has been here for a very long period of time, self-supporting, and quite a feature. to mention not shining your light in people's eyes, but I should have said don't shine your light in any mammal's eyes, because right up here is a little bat hanging down.
Aww.
Right there, blinded, but there's a bat there. And it will stay there as long as you don't disturb it. So.
Well, that's it, blind.
I love bats. They're so cute. Is that? Oh, how cute. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, if you could go a little further and just watch your step where you see the colors and the wet surface. Earlier I mentioned that the lower openings, our best guess are to allow spring water and groundwater to return to Jordan Creek. And that's what you see going on along the wall over on this side. There are different openings down low that as long as I've been giving tours, water has been flowing out of those, regardless of how dry it gets. So the water you're seeing flowing now is coming from sources like that, from Silver Springs, the park up off National, Jones Spring or Berry Spring, remember the one by the convalescent hospital? That was located somewhere near OTC, and when they expanded Chestnut Expressway, they covered that up and put in a pipe and carried part of that water into Jordan Creek, so it still contributes to the flow even today.
Oh, yeah, it's a storm now. Oh, watch out for this. Catch over here.
The railroad has no trespassing signs up there. When we do encounter people taking shelter down here, I'm not aware of anybody ever being prosecuted from that. So you'll wait back here with us, please. This is the section that would have been completed in 1928, 1929. So we did this section that we just came through. And these storm drains that we talked about, the rest of the mentioned, we steam past the storm drain right back here, that constantly, what you find is the debris constantly changes. It's always interesting to look to see what's there, which changes since last time. You'll see what that is here in a little bit. It's okay. The rest is not behind that. So,
with MSU taking out old 1900s houses and building lots and lots of student housing, we're seeing more and more young adults and young professionals moving downtown, particularly around the area of the downtown square. And since we're right under Boonville Street right now, if we went on the surface, literally right up the road, a block is the square. And so you have a high density amount of students and dog owners walking around downtown. And while the majority of the people do pick up after their pets, there's a significant amount of people, particularly we've noticed college students, that do not. And so when I'm giving a tour to maybe a FTC or an MSU group, I'm talking about buildings and other purposes, just parking. So we practice. It focus on the basic so the amount of water flowing to the land. So we tend to do things about the water and
and then Water Street is running through here. So you're at the corner of Boonville and Water Street. Right above us is Amy's corporate headquarters. So there's corrugated metal. And then the limestone that you see here, that limestone is left over from these three arches supported the shoe factory that was here in the early 1900s. Remember, that's the older section of the tunnel. In the 1930s, they expanded the box culvert system to control the flooding that was still happening with the polluted stuff out of sight, out of mind. So right now, and for most of the rest of the section, they boxed Jordan Creek in and allowed them to reclaim that valuable real estate. And So now there are buildings up above us in these corporate headquarters. This tunnel turns, goes underneath the railroad tracks, and then goes underneath the enterprise.
I guess I should follow y'all.
If you stay over there, go up here.
This is mine.
That's why we encourage people to walk on that side, the side that they're on, so that you don't get soaked when the water starts flowing. You have to think about where we are and what's going on here. Remember, this is Jordan Creek. There was a limestone bluff here. John Poe Campbell built his cabin up on top of that bluff near that natural spring. And his daughter described the limestone bluff with springs cascading, flowing out of it, water flowing back into Jordan Creek. That classic Ozark stream. This would have been a beautiful setting. Obviously, it's very different today. John Poe Campbell would not recognize his home site. If you go by the square, Founders Park is there near the square. That's very close to his cabin site, which is why it's called Founders Park. The well itself is probably across the street, and some people say it's in the basement of that National Audio building that's there. That marker's been moved. It's on the corner of that building. Different records indicate that old historic natural well that John Poe Campbell used was destroyed as the city grew and developed around his cabin site. Some people well, that could be what's going on, but we don't So what we're pretty sure is going on here, that same source of water that filled John Poe Campbell's natural well, a lot of that is still here and flowing into the basement of that building in these corporate headquarters. There's a sump pump there. And when the water level fills up in that pit, the float turns on the pump and it pumps all of that water out. As water level drops, the float shuts the pump off, and then it fills back up, the pump kicks on. So that's what's going on here. But it is that same source of water that John Poe Campbell relied on. This area, we're underneath the railroad tracks here. And if you look behind me, this area has kind of an interesting story to it. I mentioned that it's not uncommon to run into people taking shelter down here. This, when we first started giving tours, was a bit of living quarters for some people. The round rebar that you see had been cut right here, and people were able to go in and out. In fact, there was a ladder here that they would pull up when they were at home. Some of their stuff caught fire, cook stove caught fire, and the fire department had a very difficult time getting down here and putting that out. It's also not a very safe place to be for flash flood events. And so the city put in that red angle iron that you see here, and that stopped people from going back there. But you can see recently they've cut and opened that back up and still use that for shelter. There's a side tunnel up here on the left that's pretty large that goes back some distance. Sometimes there's a curtain hanging there where people are taking shelter.
In that one? In that tunnel?
Up here on the left. So if you shine your light, see that shadow cast on the left. See that opening? Right there. Yeah, right. Sometimes there are interesting discussions to address the problem. The solutions are pretty complicated, and people that know much more about it than I am are working on solutions, or I hope so. But it is fairly common to run into people taking shelter here. You've seen some of the bedrolls and things that have been washed up. Unfortunately, their belongings. If there's a flooding event and they're not here, then that stuff gets washed away.
This is dead weights in there.
But the tunnels continue on. if you continued on, they would open up near Washington Street, but we've seen most of the key features.
But I guess to get out and
It's very overgrown right now, so vegetation around the exit, you know, it takes some years.
yeah.
Cut yourself on any thorns and stuff.
So not long ago you said that people hang a curtain over, is that?
They will donate when there's a feature, like a railway track or a bridge or some other place, and it goes to a smaller conduit.
And when they boxed it in, they built a wall on that side, and they
The lid's down there by the entrance, it just popped off, sorry. Or someone popped it off is more what I imagine. Maybe I'll switch. I will, I that is a feat. Yeah.
It's a towel.
So if we get 8 inches of rain,
Yes, yeah, so it's got to go up to do it, I mean, last time I was careful, like, these are those virus. But, yeah.
Someone lost their jeans.
it's Friday. Get it, yeah. It's
That,
Friday. Perfect.
that's
You have
a
an outfit.
sleeping bag.
No.
Yeah, that's a neat picture.
Yeah,